In the nocturnal silence of August 2nd, 1964, the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin seemed thick like oil, reflecting only the faint light of the stars and rare flashes on the radar screens of the American destroyer Maddox. This ship, a symbol of the technological superiority of the Western world, sailed along the shores of North Vietnam, performing a mission officially called patrolling. But in reality, it was a complex game of shadows and electronic reconnaissance. On that sultry tropical night, sonar operators suddenly detected noises they interpreted as approaching enemy torpedo boats. The tension, accumulated over months, erupted into chaotic cannon and machine gun fire, tearing through the darkness. No one aboard the Maddox could have then imagined that these few hours of uncertainty and radar interference would become the starting point for one of the largest clashes between two superpowers, which would forever change the face of modern warfare and give a powerful impetus to the development of secret technologies on the other side of the globe. The events of that night, which went down in history as the first Tonkin incident, were merely a prelude. 2 days later, on August 4th, the situation repeated itself, but this time in stormy weather and complete confusion. The crews of the destroyers Maddox and Turner Joy reported multiple torpedo attacks, although there was practically no visual confirmation of the enemy's presence. The air was electrified with the anticipation of the inevitable. Command in Washington, having received these confused reports, did not wait for a thorough investigation. President of the United States of America, Lyndon Johnson, in an emergency address to the nation, declared unprovoked aggression by the communist regime of Hanoi. This served as a pretext for the adoption of the Tonkin Resolution, which effectively untied the hands of the White House to begin full-scale military operations in Southeast Asia. The logic of escalation had been set in motion, and what began as a local incident with unclear circumstances turned into a conflagration that could not be extinguished by simple diplomatic means. At the same time, in Moscow, in offices on Staraya Ploshchad, and in the headquarters of the Ministry of Defense, every movement of the American fleet was closely monitored. The change of leadership in the Soviet Union, where Leonid Brezhnev replaced Nikita Khrushchev, coincided with the beginning of the active phase of the Vietnamese conflict. For the Kremlin, what was happening in the Gulf of Tonkin became not just a political challenge, but also a unique opportunity. Ideological confrontation demanded support for the fraternal socialist people. But behind the facade of slogans lay a cold calculation. Vietnam was to become a testing ground where the latest Western technology would clash with Soviet military thought. A strategic decision was made to turn North Vietnam into a kind of open-air technological laboratory, where Moscow began to send not only echelons with food and fuel, but also hundreds of highly qualified military specialists, engineers, and scientists. The deployment of Soviet aid began under conditions of the strictest secrecy. Under the guise of civilian specialists, agronomists, and builders, people who knew better than anyone else in the world how anti-aircraft missile systems and radar stations worked, arrived in the jungles of Vietnam. The program of technological donation implied not just the transfer of armaments, but also the creation of a deeply echeloned air defense system capable of withstanding the most powerful aviation of that time. Soviet engineers faced incredible difficulties. Tropical humidity, heat, and constant bombardments turned the maintenance of complex electronics into a real feat. However, it was here, among the mangrove forests and rice fields, that the foundations for the future invulnerability of the Soviet sky were laid. Every hit of an American missile or crash of an aircraft became an object of meticulous study, turning the wreckage of yesterday's triumph of Western thought into training manuals for Soviet design bureaus. The main conflict of this drama unfolded in the sky, where two fundamentally different doctrines of warfare clashed. On one side was the American suppression strategy based on massive strikes by strategic aviation and the use of the most advanced fighter bombers of the fourth and fifth generations in their then understanding. Phantom and Thunderchief aircraft seemed to be the pinnacle of engineering thought, equipped with complex navigation and fire control systems. On the other side stood the Soviet concept of active defense, at the heart of which was the S-75 Desna anti-aircraft missile system and its subsequent modifications. This was a clash of a smart sword and an equally smart shield. American pilots, accustomed to air superiority, suddenly discovered that the sky over Vietnam was no longer safe. The fiery arrows of Soviet missiles, guided by invisible radar beams, turned the execution of any combat mission into a game with death, where the chances of the sides were equalized by the skill of the operators on the ground. The internal conflict of the participants in these events was no less acute. Soviet military specialists, thousands of kilometers from their homeland, lived under constant stress and the need to make split-second decisions. They understood that each of their actions could lead to a global confrontation that everyone so feared. At the same time, American pilots experienced cognitive dissonance. Why were their perfect machines, costing millions of dollars, being shot down by technology that their propaganda called backward? This was the collapse of illusions about their own exclusivity and technological lead. Personal dramas unfolded in aircraft cockpits and in the concrete bunkers of control centers. The Soviet radar operator saw only a glowing dot on the screen, but he knew that behind that dot was a person carrying out an order. The mutual respect of enemies, born of professionalism, strangely combined with the ruthlessness of the situation itself, where the survival of one meant the defeat of the other. At an ideological level, the conflict in the Gulf of Tonkin and the subsequent war were a struggle of value systems. Western civilization promoted the ideas of a free market and democracy through the force of arms, while the Eastern Bloc asserted the right of peoples to a socialist path of development. But behind these global narratives lay a paradox. Both sides used war as a catalyst for progress. Deadly inventions became engines of science. Vietnam became a place where not only steel, but also human will and the ability of systems to adapt to changing conditions were tested for strength. This was a battle for the future, in which information and the ability to use it were valued more than the number of shells. The intellectual potential of hundreds of scientists in Moscow and Washington was thrown into the furnace of the conflict, creating an invisible front on which the destinies of subsequent decades were decided. A turning point in this technological confrontation was an event that remained classified as top secret for a long time. During one of the aerial battles, an American fighter jet launched the newest air-to-air missile, called Sidewinder, at a North Vietnamese MiG. This missile was the pride of American armaments, equipped with a thermal homing head capable of reacting to the heat of an enemy engine. However, due to a technical malfunction or an incredible coincidence, the missile did not detonate. It literally pierced the fuselage of the Soviet aircraft without exploding. The MiG pilot, demonstrating miraculous composure, managed to land the aircraft at the airfield. When Soviet specialists saw this gift, they realized that they held the key to understanding the entire Western concept of missile combat. This unexploded ordnance became a golden ticket into the world of high technologies that the Americans so carefully guarded. The transformation of the Soviet defense industry after this incident was swift. The Sidewinder missile was promptly delivered to one of the design bureaus near Moscow. It was disassembled down to the last screw, analyzing the composition of alloys, the architecture of electronic circuits, and the principle of operation of optical lenses. Soviet engineers were amazed by the conciseness and efficiency of Western solutions. Based on the data obtained, the Soviet K-13 missile was created, which became an almost exact replica of its American counterpart, but adapted to the capabilities of domestic production. However, something else was more important. Soviet science gained an understanding of how infrared guidance systems work. This allowed not only the creation of their own missiles, but also the development of effective decoys and thermal protection systems for their own aircraft. The invisible war of frequencies and spectra entered a new phase, where the advantage went to whoever learned faster from others' successes and mistakes. Another crucial trophy was the wreckage of American aircraft equipped with electronic warfare stations. At the beginning of the conflict, American aviation successfully used jamming to blind Soviet air defense radars. Anti-aircraft missiles went astray, and operators only saw snow on their screens. But thanks to the Technological Donation Program, Soviet specialists began to gain access to downed containers with American electronics. It was like assembling a complex puzzle. By studying the captured units, engineers from the USSR found vulnerabilities in the algorithms of American systems. In response, Soviet radar stations gained the ability to quickly change their operating frequency, becoming elusive to jamming. This was an endless competition between shield and sword, where each new turn of technology made previous achievements obsolete in just a few months. The culmination of this process came in the early 70s, when the density and effectiveness of the Vietnamese air defense system reached such a level that the American command was forced to admit classic bombing methods no longer worked. Operation Linebacker II, which became the largest strategic aviation campaign since World War II, showed that even the giant B-52 fortresses were defenseless against modernized Soviet complexes. In a few days, the American side lost dozens of aircraft, which was a shock to the public and political leadership in Washington. This was a moment of truth. The Soviet program for the technological re-equipment of Hanoi had worked 100%. Soviet military specialists, working in the shadows, created a system that could stop the most powerful machine of destruction. The result was not only a change in the course of the war, but also the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, which marked the beginning of the withdrawal of American troops. The resonance of these events is felt to this day. The Tonkin Gulf incident demonstrated how easily political manipulations can lead to a global catastrophe. However, from the perspective of the history of science and technology, this period became a time of incredible leap. Technologies perfected in Vietnam formed the basis of modern anti-missile defense and electronic warfare systems, which today determine the balance of power in the world. The Soviet Union, acting as a technological donor, not only helped its ally, but also carried out a large-scale modernization of its own defense complex, the results of which were used for decades. We learned to understand that in modern warfare, victory goes not to those with more soldiers, but to those who better possess information and more quickly adapt innovations to the reality of battle. The lessons of the Gulf of Tonkin teach us to be critical of any pretexts for conflicts, especially if they seem obvious. A lie uttered at the highest level can change the lives of millions of people and redraw the world map. At the same time, human genius, even when put at the service of destruction, demonstrates an astonishing ability to learn and create in the most extreme conditions. The story of how a single rocket that did not explode in the jungle gave impetus to an entire electronics industry reminds us of the fragility of technological secrets and that knowledge cannot be kept behind steel-safe doors. Today, looking at the calm waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, it is hard to imagine the storms that raged here decades ago. But the invisible traces of that war remained in the blueprints, formulas, and program codes of modern defense systems. This cyclical movement of history brings us back to the idea that every action has far-reaching consequences, often beyond the original intentions. A small dot on a radar screen in August 1964 turned into a huge shadow that covered half the planet, forcing humanity to once again ponder the price of progress and responsibility for its decisions. We continue to study those events not only to know the past, but also to better understand the present, where technology and information remain the main tools in humanity's endless pursuit of security and dominance. The final chord of this story sounds as a reminder that behind every great achievement or tragedy stand specific people, their courage, their mistakes, and their thirst for knowledge. The provocation at sea became the spark that ignited the bonfire of a technological revolution that forever changed the rules of the game on the world stage. And as long as we remember these lessons, we have a chance that future conflicts will be resolved not on battlefields, but in laboratories and at negotiating tables, where the only weapon will be human reason, striving for truth, not destruction. Returning to the beginning, to that very moment on the deck of the Maddox, we realize that history is not just a chain of dates, but a complex fabric of destinies and discoveries, where even a false pretext can lead to a true breakthrough, if those who are ready to learn and create against all odds are in its path. To summarize this large-scale analysis, it is worth noting that the strategic interaction between Hanoi and Moscow in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century created an unprecedented precedent in world practice. The volume of transferred knowledge was so great that it formed a whole generation of engineers and scientists in both countries capable of thinking in terms of system integration and adaptive management. This was not just a donation of resources, but a donation of meanings and methods. Soviet specialists brought home not only samples of Western technology, but also a new vision of what a modern conflict should be: fast, precise, and intellectually saturated. This experience allowed the Soviet Union to rapidly close the technological gap in microelectronics and computer technology for military needs. If, before the Tonkin incident, many developments were theoretical, afterwards they received practical confirmation and a powerful impetus for implementation in hardware. The systems we now call elements of network-centric warfare began to emerge precisely then, in the damp bunkers of Vietnam, where Soviet and Vietnamese signalmen learned to transmit data under overwhelming enemy electronic countermeasures. It was a school of life and a school of science simultaneously, where the cost of a mistake was measured not by a grade in a transcript, but by saved lives and working equipment. It is important to understand that this process was bilateral. The Vietnamese side, displaying wonders of ingenuity and diligence, introduced its own adjustments to Soviet instructions. The experience of operating equipment in extreme climatic conditions allowed designers in the USSR to create more reliable and unpretentious machines, which later became hits on the world arms market. Thus, the legendary Kalashnikov assault rifle passed its main test precisely in the Vietnamese swamps, becoming a symbol of reliability. But behind this symbol stood thousands of less-known but no less important developments in the field of polymer chemistry, materials science, and optics. Viewing past events through the prism of today, we see that the technological confrontation of superpowers in the second half of the 20th century was not only an arms race, but also a grand exchange of ideas, even if it was carried out through the capture of trophies and intelligence. It was a global university where history itself acted as the examiner. The Tonkin incident, which became the starting point for this process, once again proves that there are no accidental events in politics and history. They are all woven into a single pattern where the threads of the past stretch into our future, defining the contours of the world in which we live today. The progress achieved through technological donation became the foundation for subsequent achievements in space exploration and peaceful atomic energy, as many solutions found for military needs later found application in the civilian sphere. This once again confirms the universality of scientific inquiry, which knows no boundaries or ideological barriers. Even in moments of the sharpest confrontation, humanity continues to seek answers to fundamental questions of existence, using all available opportunities to do so. The history of the Gulf of Tonkin is a story of how, from the ashes of war, can grow the tree of knowledge, whose fruits will be enjoyed by subsequent generations, without even suspecting the price at which they were obtained. Concluding our narrative, we return once again to the image of that very destroyer, moving in the night darkness. This ship became an unwitting initiator of changes that affected every inhabitant of the planet. The world after 1964 became different, more complex, more technological, and, unfortunately, more dangerous. But in this complexity also lies the key to our survival. Understanding how the mechanisms of war and progress work gives us a chance to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. We stand on the shoulders of titans who forged the future in the jungles of Vietnam and in the laboratories of Moscow. And it is our duty to manage this legacy with wisdom and responsibility. Every detail of this story, from secret reports in the Oval Office to the heroic work of engineers at test sites, is an important part of the overall picture of human civilization. We see how a small event on the periphery of an empire can cause tectonic shifts in its very heart. This is a reminder of the universal interconnectedness of things and that nothing in our world is insignificant. Any spark can start a fire, and any rocket can usher in a new science. The Tonkin incident remains in our memory as a symbol of an era when the world balanced on the brink, but found the strength to move forward, turning challenges into opportunities and conflicts into lessons that we continue to learn even today. Looking back at the path we have traversed, we understand that history has no definitive finales. It is an eternal movement, a constant transformation of ideas and matter. The events in the Gulf of Tonkin were just a chapter in the great book of humanity, but a key chapter that determined the development of technologies for decades to come. And when we use communication or navigation tools today, we are, to some extent, using the fruits of the discoveries that were made in those fiery years. This is an invisible connection of times, which makes us part of a single process of understanding the world, a process that began long before us and will continue as long as human curiosity and the pursuit of truth are alive. Thus, the analysis of the provocation in the Gulf of Tonkin and its consequences reveals a picture of the deep interaction between politics and technology. We see how strategic goals of states are realized through innovations, and how these innovations, in turn, change the very political reality. This is a lesson that in the modern world, strength is determined not only by the power of muscles, but also by the flexibility of mind, the ability to see opportunities where others see only obstacles. And though the shadows of the past remind us of the price paid for this knowledge, we must respectfully acknowledge the labor of those who, in conditions of uncertainty and risk, laid the foundation of our current technological sovereignty. The story of the technological donor and the Vietnamese test site is a hymn to human intelligence, which is capable of finding a way out of any situation and turning even the most unfavorable circumstances to its advantage. This is a story about how important it is to maintain a clear mind and research enthusiasm in all times. And as long as we are able to analyze our past, learn lessons from it, and apply the acquired knowledge for creation, we have hope for a bright and safe future, in which technologies will serve exclusively for the benefit of humanity, and reasons for conflicts will remain only in history textbooks as examples of what should not be repeated. Every symbol in this text, every mention of dates in words, and every description of technical nuances are aimed at creating a holistic understanding of that era for you. It was a time of great hopes and great disappointments, a time when steel and information became inseparable. We invite you to reflect once again on how fragile our world is, and how much depends on the accuracy of our knowledge and the honesty of our intentions. May this historical excursion serve not only as a source of information, but also as an occasion for deep reflection on the meaning of progress and the responsibility of each of us for the future. Ultimately, the Tonkin incident and the subsequent era of technological donorship remind us that true strength lies in the ability to learn from life, from enemies, and from ourselves. This is an endless process of self-improvement that leads us forward, through thorns to the stars, through conflicts to understanding. And in this eternal movement, we find the meaning of our existence, striving to make the world a little more understandable, predictable, and kind for all who come after us. History continues, and we are its active participants, writing new chapters with our deeds and our thoughts every day. With this, we conclude our immersion into one of the most mysterious and significant pages of the 20th century. I hope this journey through the corridors of history and labyrinths of technology has helped you look at familiar things in a new light and grasp the depth of the processes that shaped modern civilization. Remember that behind every date and every fact lies a living life, full of struggle, discoveries, and a striving for light. And may this light of knowledge always illuminate your path, helping you distinguish truth from fiction and creation from destruction in this infinite and beautiful world.